In previous lectures on vision and audition, on sight and hearing, the emphasis was on the percipient as a basic information processor, almost like a piece of photographic film paper in the case of vision, where light incident on that film, on that retina, is processed in such a way as to give rise to a visual experience. No mention was made of the overall psychological resources that the percipient brings to such situations. Rather, we see the perceiver as a kind of passive receptacle, extremely sensitive to levels of stimulation, and once that level of stimulation exceeds the absolute threshold, able to report the presence of a stimulus. Now, this is not the typical situation in which we walk about perceiving the events in the world. The typical situation is one where there are street sounds and airplanes overhead, taxi cab doors slamming, the telephone ringing, children screaming and the like, and through it all we have to hear something. We might be trying to hear a friend on the telephone while all this is going on. The typical situation then, in fact the universal situation in any detection task, is one in which some level of noise is present. Indeed, theoretically we can say that in any detection task at all, noise is omnipresent. Even if you've got the best sound reproduction facility in the world, measured carefully, you will see that within that sound-producing facility, there is some degree of noise. Electrical current itself will carry with it a certain noisy element. We refer to it as thermal noise. So in any communication system, either by way of transmission or by way of reception, one is always dealing with noise. Well, the question then becomes, what's the best way of representing a process like perception? And it has been argued, quite influentially and seminally, that perhaps the best model for sensory and perceptual functions is what is called the signal detection model, borrowed in part from the engineering sciences and in part from experimental psychology itself. Now, let me set up the signal detection paradigm, perhaps going back to an ancient history in which we were dealing with something, I don't know that you all might recall this, I believe it was called the Soviet Union. It doesn't quite exist anymore, but it used to be there and quite menacing. Now, the situation at the time was this. We had a large number of intercontinental ballistic missiles, most of them aimed at this ancient empire once called the Evil Empire, this ancient empire called the Soviet Union. We had every reason to believe that they had a massive number, perhaps a much larger number, of intercontinental missiles aimed at us. Now, as a result of an earlier presidency in which the genius of the American experience found us buying Alaska, we were able to put our detection setup, our radar systems, relatively close to the Soviet Union. We also had radar installations on the shores of the Black Sea and in Turkey and the like. So we now have these radar installations always looking at the Soviet Union. Now, of course, lots of things are up in the air all the time. ICBMs are generally not up in the air, but ducks are up in the air, pigeons, birds, people fly kites, there are airliners up in the air and the like. So the question becomes this. If you have to inform your system that you are now under a massive attack and you are duty-bound to retaliate, what characteristics must the receiving system see, as it were, in order to determine that this indeed is an attack and it's not a flight of geese headed south? This is one of the standard signal detection problems, distinguishing between a bona fide signal and other events that are taking place which, because they fail to satisfy the criteria that you assign to signals, can be treated as noise. You never, ever, ever want to start World War III and destroy the entire planet because you thought a bunch of geese actually was an ICBM attack. At the same time, if it's a bona fide ICBM attack, you surely don't want to sit back saying, look at those geese fly. So what you have to put into the system, and indeed what every percipient has to bring to a perceptual experience, is a criterion, or a set of criteria, according to which you will judge something to be X or not X. Now, let's stay with the ICBM case. one of the things we can tell the radar system is this. We remember what we're trying to do here. We're trying to gin up this system so that if it really is an ICBM attack, it is recognized as one. If it's a flock of geese, or if it's American Airlines on bringing people to Vladivostok or something, then we know that too. Well, one thing we can tell the system is this. Geese generally do not hit velocities of 18,000 miles an hour. So you might say that anything coming at a speed in excess of a certain velocity is not to be called a goose. Anything that falls short of a certain velocity is not to be called an ICBM. You might also have information regarding the trajectory. If it's coming from the Ural Mountains and it has a very, very nice arc, and it seems trained on New York City, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philadelphia, and the like, these are not the ordinary nesting places for geese, nor does American Airlines generally fly from the Ural Mountains in that path. So as you can tell the system more and more and more about the characteristics of non-ICBMs and the characteristic of ICBMs, you systematically reduce the likelihood of a false alarm, that is, of calling a goose an ICBM, and you do increase the likelihood of correct detections. Now, the standard signal detection paradigm is mirrored in this example that I offer you, which is merely a droll example. The perceptual situations in which we find ourselves are situations in which noise is always present, and the task is determining whether what we're hearing or what we're seeing is essentially merely noise, or buried in that noise there is a signal of interest. In that great crowd at Yankee Stadium during the 6th game of the World Series, is that really Uncle George I see just behind the first base dugout? It does look something like Uncle George, and if he's there, and we know he shouldn't be there, there'll be hell to pay for this. He's supposed to be at work right now. But there is ambiguity, because Uncle George is changing in his profile, he's looking down, the hat is covering his brow, and so for all practical purposes, our task is one of determining whether amidst all that noisy information there is a signal to be found. So every perceptual task can be viewed as the requirement the percipient has to distinguish between a distribution of information that is signal plus noise, because noise is omnipresent, versus noise alone. Now, here's one of life's hardships. Suppose you decide that under no circumstances, that is 0% of the time, will you ever call anything an ICBM, if in fact it could be a duck, an airplane, a kite, a balloon, and the like. That is the standard you set up is this. You will never mistake anything that isn't an ICBM for an ICBM. You never, ever, ever want to be wrong on that. As it happens, there's only one way you can achieve that. Call nothing an ICBM. The only way you can be perfect in hitting a 0 false alarm rate is to call nothing an ICBM. Now suppose you have a different criteria. You say this, look, I don't mind starting World War III because a flock of geese are flying south, but under no circumstances whatever do I want to suffer the consequences of an ICBM attack because I failed to recognize that it was that sort of attack. If it ever happens, and whenever it happens, I must always know that it's happening. I must never, ever, ever miss making that detection. There's only one way you can guarantee yourself a 100% detection rate. Call everything an ICBM. Now, there's actually a way of plotting this situation graphically. On the ordinate, on the vertical part of the graphic plot, you can put the probability of a correct detection. You can label that P sub C. And on the horizontal line, on the abscissa, you can plot the probability of a false alarm. You can label that P sub F. Now, the situation I just gave you, where you don't know much about the characteristics of ducks, ICBMs, and the like, but all you want to be sure of is this. You never want to miss an ICBM attack if there is one, You never, ever, ever want to be attacked and think it's merely noise. The plot you'll end up with is a line. It's a straight line in which, in order to achieve a 100% correct detection rate, you have to put up with a 100% false alarm rate. In order never to call an ICBM a duck, you've got to call everything. In order never to call an ICBM a duck, you've got to call nothing an ICBM. And in order never to miss an ICBM attack, you've got to call everything an ICBM attack. Now that plot of the probability of correct detection versus the probability of false alarm, in engineering is called an ROC curve, ROC, the acronym standing for the Receiver Operating Characteristics Curve of a detection system. Well, now, suppose we take this model and we apply it to the sorts of situations that I described in previous lectures on vision and hearing. A psychophysical experiment in which the subject's task is to determine whether a sound is present or a very, very dim flash of light has been presented, and we're determining the absolute and difference thresholds in vision and audition. Well, we can redo these experiments. Under the ordinary circumstance, historically, from the time of Fechner, the way you do a psychophysics experiment is you seat the subject, let's say we're looking for the visual threshold now, you seat the subject in a dark room, keep the eye dark adapted maybe for 30 or 35 minutes so that all of the photopigments have regenerated. You now have the subject with his chin in a chin rest. You might have the forehead locked in place. There might be ear locks put in there to keep the head perfectly stationary. The subject's task is to fixate a very, very dim red patch so that you know where the eye is pointed, and you're going to pulse these very, very weak test flashes to a particular place on the retina. And when you instruct the subject as to what the subject should be doing, you say, now look, whatever you do, don't guess. Say now when in fact you see a flash, but if you don't see a flash, don't say anything. That is, the standard psychophysical procedure is very much arranged in such a way as to limit and eliminate guessing. Now, some have argued, and I think quite effectively, that this actually builds a high threshold criterion into the subject. It's very much like saying, look, don't ever call a duck an ICBM. Now, if you're instructing the subject never to guess, then the subject is only going to report the presence of a stimulus when that stimulus is almost bold in its influence on the system, so that you might actually be getting a distorted view of what the absolute threshold actually is. The system may be much more sensitive if you give it some breathing room, as it were. Well, how do you give the system breathing room? Well, one way of giving it breathing room, this is as true of radar systems as it is of subjects in perception studies, is by providing what is called a payoff matrix that moves judgments more in the low threshold direction. You might want to encourage subjects to do some guessing. Now, how might that payoff matrix be arranged? Suppose we told the subject this. Look, this is a study of visual sensitivity. On some trials, you're actually going to be presented with a flash of light. It will be very, very dim. It's not clear that you will see this flash. On other trials, there will be no flash at all. A trial begins just after the presentation of a tone. So if you hear boop, then in an interval following that tone, there will either be a flash or not a flash. If you see a flash, just say now. And if you see nothing, don't say anything at all. Now, the way we're going to do this, Smith, is as follows. If after that signal is presented, there is a flash and you miss it, it will cost you 50 cents. If there's a flash and you get it, you will get $2. Now look at how we've arranged the payoff. It is now quite in Smith's interest to guess. In fact, if Smith really is a corrupt and utterly materialistic person, Smith should probably just sit there saying yes all the time. It's only going to cost him 50 cents when he's guilty of a false alarm, and he gets $2 every time he... Now, we might also say to Smith, by the way, on only 2% of the trials will there be a flash. So we can defeat the materialistic capitalist impulses in Smith if we want to do it. But the main point I want to make is this. We can build a different threshold standard into the percipient by arranging the payoff matrix in such a way as very much to encourage guessing in doubtful cases or very much to discourage guessing in doubtful cases. Well, studies of this sort have been done, and they take the following form. First thing we want to determine is this. When a subject, quote, guesses, close quote, is that subject really guessing? Now, what signal detection theory tells us is this. Guessing is not just an empty kind of, I have absolutely no idea, I'm flipping a coin. Guessing is the performance of a system that does not have a settled criterion for assigning something to the category of signal plus noise versus only noise. Well, let's do a study of this sort. And there are many studies of this kind, and they all yield the same general results. We do a study of this sort. We tell the percipient the following. You're going to be presented with a series of tones. Those tones will each mark out a 5-second interval. So tone A, B, C, D, E. That's a 25-second stretch with 5-second intervals in there. During one or more of those intervals or none of those intervals, a flash of light may be presented. That is, on any given trial, there may actually be a very, very weak flash of light. What we want you to do is this. If you think a flash of light was presented, tell us during which interval you think it occurred. Now, when you do that study, you give the subject the task. All right, let's say the subject says, yes, I believe a light was presented, and during interval C. Now you say to the subject, all right, just in case you're wrong, what other interval might you pick? Now the subject might say B. Now note this. The a priori probability that the subject would guess right, if the subject were just sitting back with his eyes closed and guessing, he'd have 1 chance in 5 of guessing right. Having used up that 1 chance, he would now have 1 chance in 4 of his second guess being right. He would have 1 chance in 3 of his third guess being right. Do you see? Well, now what we can determine is this. How much better than chance are subjects in these studies, encouraged to guess now, how much better than chance is their guessing rate? And it turns out that subjects right down to the 4th and 5th guess in a multiple guess situation are still performing better than chance. You see what's going on here is this. The subject's first guess is a high threshold criterion guess. This is where he's trying to be certain in his judgments. Now, when you loosen things up and say, all right, just in case you didn't get it there, where do you think the flash might have been? You're now moving him to a lower threshold criterion, and he's still guessing at a rate better than chance. Let me give you the punchline for this entire enterprise. The punchline is this. Properly conducted studies using a signal detection theory model have raised grave questions about whether there really is a lower threshold at all. That is, once you put together the experiment in such a way, not only as to allow guessing, but as to quantify the degree to which the guess improves on mere chance, there seem to be energy levels that are not low enough for a subject to fail to report them, at least at some guessing level. That is, once you make the criterion loose enough for the subject, as it were, to avail himself or herself of any information that may have got into the system at all, we discover that not only are the sensory systems quite sensitive, they may be so sensitive as to have no lower threshold whatever. If there is a signal present in that otherwise massive array of noise, under the right conditions, encouraging guessing and the like, with the right payoff matrix, there's reason to believe that the sensory systems, and therefore the percipient himself, will report it and detect it. Now, there's something in this that I think actually serves as a kind of general model in psychology. I don't want to promote it. I simply want to offer it as a kind of heuristic. We'll get to heuristics when we look at thinking and cognition and the like. A heuristic is a a technique for solving certain problems or understanding what kind of problem it is, a sort of rule of thumb, when in doubt, do X, Y, and Z. Well, the signal detection model seems in many respects to be a quite useful heuristic within psychology at large. For example, take our social interactions. Now, I recall once sitting on a bus in Manhattan and with a friend, and across the way was an elderly gentleman who seemed to be scowling at my friend, just looking in a very nasty way at my friend. My friend was someone who had studied English literature at Columbia and happily had been spared all the knowledge that comes from the study of psychology. So my friend had no idea that the person who seemed to be scowling at him actually was the victim of Parkinson's disease, and that there wasn't any emotion behind this facial expression at all. It just happened to be one of the symptoms of that condition. Now, the face is the same to all percipients. What's behind the look, what one extracts from the look, of course, is going to depend on a variety of factors, including the knowledge one has about the causes of various facial expressions. This is like telling the system, ducks do not enter the atmosphere at 18,000 miles an hour. The more information you can give the system, the less likely it is to commit false alarms. Now, in our daily social interactions are fraught with noisy elements. We constantly have to try to read through these very, very noisy distributions of input to find the correct signal. What is it that characterizes the paranoid personality? The paranoid personality always assumes that whatever the input is, it includes a threat of some kind. Someone is out to get one. Why did you say that? I know what you meant. I do not like that tone of voice. I saw you looking at me from across the room. Now, what kind of an information processor is this? This is an information processing system in signal detection terms, designed never to miss an attack if in fact there is one. Well, of course, the only way you'll never miss an attack, if in fact there is one, is to call everything an attack. Do you see? Now, I'm not suggesting that we make great headway in our understanding of paranoid schizophrenia by reducing this to a signal detection model. But if the signal detection model were applicable to something like this at all, then clearly one of the objectives of therapy would be to provide that system with the kind of information that allows it to make distinctions between noise-only distributions of information and signal plus noise. What you might do is, for example, proceed to show the individual a series of facial expressions from happy to sad to angry to ironic to quizzical, and have the person actually memorize the characteristics that go along with expressions of that kind. That is, actually take the symptoms and treat the symptoms as a species of ignorance to be corrected by providing the system with ever more information. Now, building memory into a detection system is absolutely essential if you're going to improve on the standard receiver operating characteristic curve. That is, if you want to design this system so that for every increase in correct detection, you do not invite an increase in the false alarm rate. Remember, what you'd most like to do is this. You'd like to have a 100% correct detection rate and never a false alarm. Now, there are good theoretical reasons for saying that's never going to happen. But you certainly can get a gain in the correct detection rate without buying a comparable increase in the false alarm rate. And you do this in the following ways. First, with a payoff matrix that very much encourages correct detection rates. You want to jack that up. But then by supplying the system with sufficient information so that the percipient or the radar system, the radar installation, is able to make distinctions between signal plus noise and noise alone. In our social interactions, we have an obligation, I'm inclined to call it a moral obligation, an ethical obligation, to make no judgments as to the guilt or innocence, the intentions, malevolent or otherwise, of those we're dealing with, until we've provided ourselves with the kind of information that will make false alarms ever less likely. Now, actually, we do have an institution in place that was doing this long before we had signal detection theory, and that institution is called the jury institution, and ably improved by rules of evidence. What is it that rules of evidence at the law are seeking to establish? Rules of evidence are trying to establish the difference between facts are everywhere, and those facts that actually match up intelligibly with what the defendant has been charged with. So, for example, fingerprints are regarded as circumstantial evidence. Why are fingerprints merely circumstantial evidence? All fingerprints on a murder weapon establish is that the defendant actually held the weapon. But fingerprints alone don't establish that the defendant fired the weapon. The defendant might have come into the room hours later and picked up the weapon. So that's just circumstantial. Now, if we know that the defendant had a motive to do this, if we know that the defendant bought the weapon, if we also know that the defendant has residual powder burns from having fired the weapon, well now, and of course all this is circumstantial also, but the weight of evidence is beginning to move very much in favor of a conviction and away from the possibility that these are mere coincidences. Now, how does this become possible? It becomes possible because in the history of criminal trials, data of this sort have matched up very, very reliably with successful and correct convictions, where subsequently the individual actually admits that he did do it. And you know that where there are powder burns and there are fingerprints, etc., 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 you're on the right track. Now, if that's circumstantial evidence, what would direct evidence be? Well, direct evidence is eyewitness testimony. This is where somebody actually says, I saw him fire the weapon. You might be interested to know that eyewitness testimony can be extremely unreliable, whereas fingerprints and the like are extremely reliable. Most convictions are won on the basis of so-called circumstantial evidence. Circumstantial evidence is not bad evidence, it's just that it's circumstantial. It might be extremely reliable. Now, I want to bring this back to signal detection theory itself. Suppose you set out, under no circumstances whatever, to convict an innocent person. You never wanted to convict an innocent person. No matter what the result would be, the long-range social results would be, it's never permissible to punish the innocent. There's only one way you could achieve that. Everyone must be declared innocent. Suppose, on the other hand, you never wanted some guilty felon to go free. Whatever else the costs might be, if that felon is guilty, you want that felon to do time. Always. Never want to miss under any circumstances. There's only one way you can achieve that. Everyone has to be declared guilty. So, what's the moral of the tale? She loves me not. Down the street he walks, picking little leaves off a vine, off something plucked off a privet hedge. She loves me not. What is it we're doing when we're doing things like this? What is Hamlet doing when he wonders whether to be or not to be? Whether it is nobler to take action against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them, do you see? Should I do this sort of thing? What Hamlet and what the young lover are trying to do in these ritual acts or through soliloquies is tap into the memory system. What do I know? What's available to me? What happens if I keep living? What happens if I stop living? What might that dream bring, do you see? She loves me not is a way we have of rehearsing iteratively through our memory to come up with just the information, just enough to know the difference between a distribution that is merely a distribution of noise and one in which that signal is actually there. And when we, in fact, rely on our memories and the best information available to us before committing ourselves to a judgment as to whether something is X or Y, we are behaving not only as good signal detection systems, but we're behaving in a way that's quite judicious.